This is Michelle Reinhardt, and she was a legislator in the Montana 2009 legislative session representing House District 97 for the Democrat Party. And she brought forward about 68 bills, and almost all of them on the subject of land use planning. And I felt that she targeted, at the state level, Ravalli County because we had repealed our growth policy. And one of the ways that she did this is she brought a bill forward on interim zoning. Now I gotta tell you, there's like three different kinds of zonings. You have the voluntary zoning districts, which means that if your little neighborhood decides to invoke democracy, mob rule, and steal property rights from the rest of your neighbors, as long as 60% of you decide to do it, then you can go ahead and voluntarily steal property from your neighbors. Or you have, of course, permanent zoning, which is what the growth policy repeal got rid of. And then you have interim zoning. And the idea behind interim zoning is that if you can define an emergency, you can put in some temporary zoning regulations that only last for a short time period while you have public hearings to decide whether or not you're going to have permanent zoning. Now, they can almost never define an emergency because they're always talking about, say, clean air and clean water. And right after the growth policy repeal, all the testing came back from the state on the rivers in Ravalli County. And what they said is that we have clean water. And they were actually shocked, according to the report, because they even went to high septic areas, by their own words, and looked there because they figured that there would be high nitrate and phosphorus levels in those areas because of the high concentration of septics. But their conclusion was that we have good water, and even in those high concentration areas of septics, they were unable to find this. The reason why is because we have good septic law in Montana. The scientists say that nothing seeps through the soil more than 50 feet. And our regulation is you can't have your septic system within 100 feet of the floodplain. And that's just the floodplain. That's not the water itself. And so you're at least double the distance needed in order to protect the water. And so the septics really do need to have a regulation on them because they are proven to harm the water. But the houses don't. I mean, wood and metal and those kind of things don't directly harm the environment. It's the septic system. But you would have to prove this emergency. You'd have to prove that we weren't going to have clean water, for example, in order to have an interim stream side setback, which they're unable to do. So she brought forward a bill saying, well, let's just take the words emergency out of the interim zoning. Then they can just put it on for any reason, and it acts a lot like permanent zoning. Well, you got to realize the scope of what she's trying to do. I mean, with 68 bills, from my understanding, it costs anywhere between $1,000 and $7,000 to bring a bill forward, depending on how far it makes it through the process. And here she is with 68 bills, and almost all of them are about taking away people's private property rights. The other problem is that, from my understanding, she worked as a planner, or does, in Missoula. And so here she sits on the local government committee at the legislature, and she's basically making regulations that would help her facilitate her job as a planner. So to me, that's a huge conflict of interest. And so I wrote here she makes a living working for UN Agenda 21, and I'll explain UN Agenda 21 here more in the next segment. But she also brought forward the Big Sky River Act. And what this is state streamside zoning. And this came under House Bill 455. And the premise of the bill is that originally they wanted to take 250 feet, steal it on a bunch of rivers on the western side of Montana, 250 on each side, so 500 feet total, without paying for it. One of the reasons why they wanted to utilize the western rivers is because when they tried to bring the bill once before, the eastern side of the state wasn't having any of it, and it went down easily. So they kind of gerrymandered the rivers in this next legislative session in order to try and convince everybody to go for it. Now, she is a Democrat, but she had a lot of help from Republicans. In fact, Gary McLaren, who was a legislator at the time, a Republican in House District 89 here in Ravalli County, he co-sponsored this bill, and so did Senator Jim Shockley. Well, these two Republicans knew that the growth policy had just been repealed. We were stopping zoning, stopping stream side setback, and here they come up at the state level and they try to backdoor what the voters in Ravalli County had told them, and of course they're going against the Constitution. Now, with full disclosure, I do gotta say, Gary McLaren eventually voted in committee to not do the stream side setback, but that's just after we brought such hardcore pressure on him that he had to change his position. So he went from co-sponsoring the bill to voting against it. And it was a tie vote, which made it fail in committee. But you see, here we had to take all this time out of our lives, go up there, testify. There was over 70 of us that testified against it. We had to have emails and phone calls. And I just think that when a representative takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, that means uphold it. It doesn't mean break it. And I certainly don't want to babysit my legislators. I want them to just go up there, represent the Constitution, and uphold their oath of office. And if they can't do that, I think we really need to quit sending them.